On an American tour, I was repeatedly stopped by customs officials because I'd been pranked by Rod Stewart.
David's team.
Right. That's
Rod Stewart is a popular singer.
Thank you. So you're on tour in America?
Yes.
The United States of?
And South America.
South America where?
Brazil.
Just Brazil?
Yeah, forget the Rod Stewart bit. This is the real interesting bit.
OK, so we were doing a show, and Rod Stewart was there.
Which of the countries of the Americas did Rod Stewart attend your show in?
Well, this was in Ireland.
Had he come just to see McFly?
No, he was doing the same show. It was a toy show.
A toy show?
Yeah, at Christmas time, big celebration, loads of toys.
Yes.
And McFly and Rod Stewart.
Was it a dream you had?
So Rod was there, and he's like, "Hey, Danny!" And I'm like, "Hey, Rod!"
Sure you haven't been watching Rocky?
So he said, "Do you want a lift?"
Does he mean drugs?
He went back home. He's like, "Well, I'll give you a lift on my jet."
Wasn't he sailing?
He said, "Oh, I need your passports." So we get on the plane, give our passports to him, and then fly to London.
Right.
So then we get a call from our tour manager. I think he was applying for a visa. So then he was like, "Guys, bad news." And he'd drawn willies on our heads.
Rod Stewart?
Like, yeah.
So Rod Stewart...
Oh, on your passport?
Yeah, no.
Just assume that you just fell asleep on the plane.
So did this mean they wouldn't recognise you at customs unless you drew a willy on your own?
It wasn't fun travelling around. Every customs were like, "You think that's funny?" Like, no, but you won't. The story is Rod Stewart drew it.
Well, it's going to delay you a lot if you tell this story.
When you told people at customs that Rod Stewart had drawn these appendages on your head, did they believe you?
Well, no, so we stopped saying that.
Why would Rod Stewart be performing at a toy show in Ireland? That doesn't add up.
Oh, but it's all right for McFly to do that, isn't it?
Right, time to go for a guess, David. What do you think?
OK.
I think it's false.
You think it's...
I don't think it's true.
You don't think it's true? I think it's true. I'm not confident enough to overrule. I'm just, you know...
Well, what are you doing in the captain's seat, then, you coward?
Despite my scepticism, we're going to say, as a team, that we think that's a lie.
You think it's a lie? OK, Danny, was it a lie or were you actually telling the truth?
I was actually telling the truth.
Whoa!
It is true.